The farm had been abandoned for nearly 20 years before the Harpers signed the papers and took the keys from the real estate agent, who spoke too quickly and smiled too tightly when asked about the land's history, as if eager to change the subject before any inconvenient truth slipped out. The house itself, though weathered and gray with age, had stood surprisingly sturdy against the endless winds that blew across the plains of Kansas. Its clappered walls and rusting tin roof bore the scars of neglect, but held a quiet dignity, as though it had been waiting all this time for someone to inhabit it again. Around it stretched acres of dry fields, the remnants of old fences, and a yard that sloped gently toward the east, where an enormous elm tree spread its crooked branches like skeletal arms. It was under this tree that the family noticed the well, its mouth sealed with a heavy, rusted iron lid that seemed far too elaborate for something as simple as a forgotten water source. Unlike the sagging barn or the cracked concrete path to the porch, the well appeared untouched by the years. Moss clung to its circular stone walls, and the metal cover was chained tight as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed closed. Laura Harper had remarked, half jokingly, that it looked like the kind of thing you might find in an old horror movie. But her husband Daniel only smiled, brushing off her words with the practical air of someone eager to make the most of a new beginning. Their son, Ethan, lingered by the well longer than either of them, running his fingers along the grooves in the stone and pressing his ear against the cool metal before being called inside to help unpack. The first days passed uneventfully, filled with the usual chaos of settling into a new home. Boxes spilling across the floor, furniture scraping against wood, the smell of dust shaken loose after so many dormant years. Yet even in those early days, Daniel noticed a strange weight to the nights, as though the darkness clung thicker around the farmhouse than it ever had in the suburbs they left behind. There was a silence too deep, an almost unnatural stillness that made every creak of the old house echo like a warning. Out beyond the windows, where the fields melted into horizon, the stars looked sharper, brighter, and somehow colder. It was during one of those first nights that Daniel awoke with the distinct feeling that someone had whispered his name. He lay in the dark, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his wife beside him, trying to convince himself it had been nothing more than the echo of a dream. But the sound had been so close, so deliberate, that he found himself holding his breath, straining to hear through the quiet. Minutes passed, then an hour, and he eventually drifted back into uneasy sleep. Though when morning came, he remembered the whisper more clearly than the dream that had followed. By the end of the week, he was certain something was wrong. It began with small things. The dog refusing to go near the elm tree, standing rigid with its fur bristling whenever they took it into the yard. Ethan insisting that he could hear a faint ringing sound coming from outside, like a telephone muffled by distance. And Laura finding dead birds on the porch steps 2 mornings in a row, their necks twisted at unnatural angles. Each time they tried to explain it away. Coincidences, bad luck, the nervous imagination of a child. But the unease only deepened. One evening, Daniel lingered in the yard after sunset, letting the chill wind pass over him as the last of the light drained from the sky. The iron lid of the well seemed to glimmer faintly in the moonlight, as though it were sweating in the cold, and he felt an impulse to walk toward it, though every instinct told him to stay away. Standing above it, he could hear nothing but the hollow rush of blood in his ears. Yet there was an undeniable sense that something lay beneath, waiting. When he finally turned back toward the house, he thought he saw the chain that held the lid rattling ever so slightly. though there was no breeze strong enough to move it. That night, long after Laura and Ethan had gone to bed, Daniel sat in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey and the dim bulb overhead buzzing like an insect. He told himself he would not look outside. He would not let the thought of the well crawl deeper into his mind. But inevitably, his eyes strayed to the window. Beyond the glass, in the silver wash of moonlight, he saw the lid was no longer flush with the stone. It had shifted just slightly, enough for a sliver of blackness to show where there should have been none. And in that silence, pressing against the edges of hearing, came a faint sound that froze him where he sat. A voice. His own voice, calling softly from the bottom of the well. The following morning, Daniel told himself he had imagined it. He had not been sleeping well since the move, and the fatigue of long days repairing fences and clearing out the barn had worn him down to the point where he was prone to half-dreams. He explained away the image of the shifted lid as nothing more than a trick of moonlight. A shadow bending reality into something sinister. Yet the unease clung to him with a persistence that no amount of work or distraction could shake. He kept glancing out the kitchen window throughout the day, half expecting to see the lid wide open, and though it remained firmly in place, he could not rid himself of the memory of that soft, impossible voice. By the second week, the dog disappeared. It had been a nervous animal since the move, whining whenever it was forced into the yard after dark. But Laura had dismissed it as simple adjustment. One morning, Daniel found the leash snapped near the porch, the collar lying in the dirt. He searched the fields for hours, calling the dog's name until his throat was raw, but there was no trace. No tracks, no sound, only the hush of the wind sliding across the dry grass. Ethan, pale and unusually quiet, asked if he could stay inside from then on. When pressed, the boy muttered that the dog had been standing at the well the night before, growling into the darkness as if something invisible had been staring back at him. Daniel tried to dismiss it, but a heaviness settled in his chest, a cold suspicion that the boy was telling the truth. Soon after, Ethan began complaining of a faint ringing that woke him in the middle of the night. At first, Daniel assumed it was tinnitus, or perhaps the lingering hum of an electrical wire. But he too began to notice it. A subtle vibration that seemed to tremble at the edge of hearing, like a phone ringing through walls too thick to carry the sound clearly. Sometimes it came when he stood near the elm. Sometimes it followed him inside, thin and distant yet persistent. And every time it left behind a crawling unease that made the skin at the base of his neck prickle. Laura claimed not to hear it, but her face hardened when Daniel mentioned it, as though she had but refused to admit it aloud. The nights grew heavier. On several occasions, Daniel woke to find the boy's bed empty, only to discover him standing barefoot at the back door, his hand resting against the glass as though about to step outside. When asked what he was doing, Ethan would say, almost matter-of-factly, that he had heard his mother calling from outside, asking him to come to the well. Each time Laura swore she had been asleep, and Daniel began locking the doors before bed, slipping the keys into his pocket like a man warding off an invisible thief. Still, the boy's sleep grew restless, punctuated by murmurs too low to understand. And more than once Daniel thought he caught his son whispering back to a voice that no one else could hear. The farm itself seemed to change in ways too subtle to describe, yet impossible to ignore. The air smelled faintly of damp stone even on the driest days, and the soil near the elm tree remained moist long after rain had passed, as though the earth there exhaled a hidden breath. The well, though still sealed, seemed to brood beneath its lid. The iron damp and slick to the touch, no matter how hot the sun burned above it. Daniel found himself walking circles around it without realizing, drawn to its silent gravity, until the sudden awareness of what he was doing broke through and left him cold with dread. One evening, as twilight bled across the fields, he returned from the barn to find Ethan crouched beside the well. The boy's head was tilted, ear pressed almost tenderly against the lid, his small fingers tracing the chain that bound it shut. Daniel's shout startled him, and Ethan jerked upright, his eyes wide, his face pale as chalk. When asked what he had been doing, the boy said only that he had heard something calling his name. Soft at first, then louder, until he could not ignore it. Daniel scolded him harshly, pulling him away, but the fear in his own chest eclipsed the anger. That night, he could not sleep at all, lying awake with the certainty that something beneath that lid was stirring. The final blow came 3 nights later. Daniel awoke to the sound of a phone ringing. It was sharp, insistent, undeniable, though when he fumbled for the device on his nightstand, its screen remained black. Still, the ringing continued, muffled now, as if drifting from somewhere deep below the house. He followed it through the darkened rooms, every step tight with dread, until he stood at the back door. Beyond the glass, the yard was drenched in pale light, the elm trees standing stark against the horizon, and the ringing was louder now, carrying across the night like an unanswered call. His gaze dropped to the well. The lid was no longer closed. It lay half-shifted, the chain slack, and the blackness inside yawned wide as a mouth. The ringing poured up from it, echoing in his skull and layered beneath the sound, so faint that he almost wished he had not noticed, came a voice. It was Ethan's voice this time. "Dad, come down here, please. I need you." Daniel's hand trembled on the doorframe. For a moment he nearly turned the lock and stepped outside. But something deeper than fear rooted him still. Some primal knowledge that the voice was not his son's, not really, and that to answer it would be to invite something unspeakable into the world. He backed away from the glass, heart hammering, and when he finally forced himself to look again, the ringing had stopped. The yard lay silent. The lid of the well was sealed once more, the chain pulled tight. Yet the silence did not soothe him. If anything, it was worse than the ringing, for he could not tell whether the sound had ever truly ceased, or whether it had simply moved inside him, waiting. Daniel had never been one for neighbors. In the city, they had been faceless presences, glimpsed only when garbage cans were pulled to the curb, or when passing in the elevator with strained smiles. Here, though, neighbors came in the form of people who had lived their entire lives in one place, whose memories stretched back decades, and whose silences carried as much meaning as their words. It was during a trip into town for supplies that he met Henry Cottrell, a man in his late 70s with skin like cracked leather and a way of speaking that made even ordinary phrases sound like confessions. Henry ran the hardware store, though most of the time Daniel saw him sitting on a stool by the counter, staring out the window as if watching for something no one else could see. They spoke first of tools, of fencing nails and weatherproof paint. But the conversation turned the moment Henry asked which property Daniel had bought. When Daniel mentioned the farm off County Road 14, the old man's face changed in a way that unsettled him. His eyes narrowed, his mouth pressed tight, and after a pause long enough to grow uncomfortable, he said quietly, "That'd be the Harper place now, wouldn't it? With the well out back." Daniel admitted as much, adding with a strained chuckle that his son seemed fascinated by it. Henry did not return the smile. He only leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter, and asked if the boy had heard anything yet. The phrasing was strange enough to cut through Daniel's nervousness, and he found himself asking what exactly Henry meant. The old man looked at him for a long time, as if weighing whether to speak, before finally lowering his voice. "They built that well before the town was even a town," Henry said. "First settlers out there dug it, back when they were trying to tame this land. Didn't take long before strange things started happening. Families gone without a trace, livestock vanishing, children wandering out into the dark. Always at night. Always near the well." Daniel tried to laugh it off, though the sound came thin and hollow. But Henry's eyes stayed fixed on him, cold and steady. "They said it wasn't just a well," he went on. "Said there was something underneath, older than the dirt, older than people. Something that calls to you, uses your own voice or the voice of someone you love. That's how it gets you close. Once you answer, once you listen too long, you're as good as gone." Daniel felt his mouth go dry. He wanted to call it a story, a piece of backwoods superstition, but the weight with which Henry spoke left no room for easy dismissal. "And what happens?" Daniel asked. "If you don't answer?" The old man shrugged. "It waits. It's patient. That's the worst part. Don't need to rush. Might wait years for the right moment. But once it's taken notice of you, there's no putting it back to sleep. Best you can do is leave. Seal it off and don't look back." The conversation ended there, with Daniel gathering his things in silence. But the words followed him home like a shadow. He tried not to mention it to Laura, unwilling to add to the unease that had already seeped into the house. But Ethan seemed to sense something had changed. The boy's questions came more often now. Did he think the well was deep enough to reach another place? Did he think voices could travel through stone? Did he believe something could live in the dark for centuries, waiting? Each question unsettled Daniel more than the last, especially when Ethan asked them with a calmness that made it seem as though he already knew the answers. That night, Daniel dreamed he was standing at the bottom of the well. The stones rose endlessly upward, slick with moss, their edges closing tighter and tighter until the circle of the sky above looked no larger than a coin. Around him, the air was damp and heavy, filled with a faint ringing that grew louder the longer he listened. And when he opened his mouth to call out, the sound that emerged was not his own voice. It was Ethan's, small and trembling, echoing against the walls. He woke gasping, his hands clenched into fists, the sheets damp with sweat. Days bled together after that, each one carrying the same oppressive weight, each night drawing them closer to something unseen yet unavoidable. Laura had grown pale and irritable, snapping at both him and Ethan. Though Daniel could not tell whether she had begun to hear the same things, or whether she was simply reacting to the tension gnawing at the household. The boy, however, changed in ways that chilled him. He spent long stretches staring out the window toward the elm tree, his lips moving as if whispering to someone Daniel could not see. Once, Daniel crept close enough to hear, only to realize Ethan was repeating a phrase over and over. One evening, unable to bear the silence, Daniel returned to town under the pretense of needing more nails. He found Henry sitting in the same place, staring out the same window, as though he had never moved since their last conversation. This time, Daniel pressed him harder, demanding to know what had really happened to the families who once lived on the farm. Henry was slow to answer, But eventually, he said that people had gone missing for generations. Some were found drowned at the bottom of the well, though no rain had filled it. Others were never seen again, their homes left as if they had simply walked out mid-meal. "It don't just take you," Henry murmured. "It keeps you, uses you. That's why sometimes you'll hear voices even long after the person's gone. They're still down there calling, because it wants company, wants to lure the rest of you in." When Daniel asked why no one had destroyed it, Henry gave a humorless smile. "Tried. Filled it with stone once. Weeks later it was open again, like nothing had touched it. Tried fire too, but it just swallowed the smoke. Thing is, it ain't a well in the way you're thinking. It's an opening. And openings, they don't close easy." Daniel drove home with his hands locked tight on the steering wheel. His stomach knotted. For the first time since moving, he considered leaving everything behind. The house, the fields, the dream of a fresh start. Yet as he pulled into the drive, he saw Ethan standing once again by the elm tree, his small frame silhouetted in the fading light, head tilted as if listening. The sight froze him. For in that moment, with the shadows long and the dusk settling heavy across the land, he could have sworn there was someone standing beside the boy, just beyond the reach of vision. Tall, thin, featureless, yet leaning close as though whispering into his ear. And when Ethan turned to look at him, his eyes were not his own. They were too dark, too deep, reflecting not the fading sky, but something far beneath it. The decision to confront the well came less from courage than from a weariness so heavy that Daniel could no longer endure the constant drip of dread seeping into every corner of his days. He had tried denial, telling himself that the voices were tricks of fatigue, that Ethan's behavior was nothing more than the unsettled mind of a boy forced into a strange new home. He had tried distraction, burying himself in repairs and chores until his hands blistered and his back throbbed. Yet every effort collapsed beneath the same truth. The well remained, and with each passing night, its presence pressed harder against the boundaries of their lives, demanding acknowledgement. It was a Friday evening when he found the lid ajar again. The chain slackened, though the lock still hung intact, as if something had lifted the weight from below, without troubling the mechanism at all. The dog had never returned, and the farm had fallen into a rhythm of silence, broken only by Ethan's murmurs and the phantom ring that haunted Daniel at the edges of hearing. He told Laura he needed to check the foundation of the barn, waited until she had gone to bed, then returned to the yard with a flashlight in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. The night was windless. The fields lay flat beneath a swollen moon, and the elm tree loomed with its crooked branches stretching like claws against the sky. Daniel's breath steamed in the cool air, each exhale sounding too loud, too fragile, as though even the act of breathing might draw attention to him. The well sat waiting, its lid shifted just enough to reveal the ink-black circle beneath. As he approached, the smell reached him first. Damp stone, rot, and something faintly metallic, like blood dried long ago but stirred fresh again. His stomach knotted, yet he forced himself to kneel, pushing the lid aside with both hands until it clanged softly against the stone rim. The beam of the flashlight cut downward, illuminating a shaft of slick gray stones that descended farther than his eyes could follow. The rope ladder bolted into the wall looked ancient, the wood of its rungs blackened with rot, yet it appeared intact enough to hold weight. He swallowed, tied the rope around a nearby root of the elm for extra security, and lowered himself slowly into the darkness. The cold hit him immediately, a chill that sank through his clothes and bit into his skin as though the air itself were alive and hungry. Each step down brought with it the echo of his movements, the faint creak of rope, the scuff of boots against stone, and always the sense that the darkness below was rising to meet him rather than waiting at a distance. Moisture slicked the stones, making them glisten like wet skin under the light. He descended 20 feet, 30, maybe more, the sense of time fraying as the air thickened, damp and almost suffocating. Then the first sound came. Not a whisper, not the ringing that haunted his dreams, but the faint scrape of movement just beyond the beam of the flashlight. Daniel froze, holding the light steady, his heart hammering so loud it drowned all else. The beam caught the glisten of something on the wall, a smear of wetness darker than water, glistening like mucus. He reached out despite himself, fingertips brushing the slick surface, and recoiled at the gelatinous texture. It was fresh, still warm. From the depths below came a new sound, soft but unmistakable. The echo of his own voice. "Ethan," it said, the syllables curling upward like smoke, distorted by the hollow shaft, yet still clear enough to freeze him where he clung. "Ethan, come to me." His breath hitched. He swung the light wildly, searching for the shape that might have produced the sound. But the stones stared back in silence. A moment later, it came again, louder, with a strange echo as though more than one mouth were speaking in unison. "Ethan, come down." Daniel clenched his teeth until his jaw ached. He wanted to scream back that it was not real, that it was nothing but an echo. But fear held him mute. He continued down another few feet, though every nerve in his body screamed to climb back. The slime grew thicker, streaking the walls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though clawed by hands too large to belong to any human. His boot slipped on one rung, and when he steadied himself, the flashlight beam swept across a mark gouged deep into the stone. A groove that looked like fingernails dragged desperately downward. He nearly turned back then, nearly abandoned the descent, when the light caught something farther below. A flicker of pale movement, gone in an instant, like the retreat of something massive pulling into shadow. His stomach dropped. The rope trembled faintly, though he had not moved. It was as if something below had brushed it. Then came the ringing. Not faint this time, not distant, but deafening. A shrill metallic clang that reverberated through the well so hard his bones seemed to vibrate. The flashlight slipped in his hand, beam swinging wildly across the stones. Over the ringing came his own voice again, but stretched, layered, as though spoken by a crowd of Daniels, all calling in broken unison. The sound was unbearable, shaking the very stones, forcing him to clap one hand over his ear while clinging desperately with the other. In the chaos, the flashlight struck the wall, its beam falling downward, and for the briefest instant, it illuminated the bottom. He saw a surface that was not stone at all, but something shifting, pulsing like flesh breathing beneath a thin layer of water. Faces rose in its surface, gray, distorted, eyes wide with silent screams. Before sinking again into the rippling mass, among them he swore he recognized one, pale and childlike, mouth opening in a silent plea. Ethan's face. The rope lurched beneath him. Daniel's body acted before his mind caught up, scrambling upward with desperate speed, boots slipping, hands burning on the rope as he pulled himself rung by rung toward the faint circle of moonlight above. The ringing rose higher, shrill enough to shatter thought, and the voices followed him up the shaft, echoing with laughter and sobs, repeating his name over and over in tones both mocking and desperate. Something scraped against the stones below, something enormous dragging itself upward. But Daniel did not look down. He climbed until the rim of the well came into reach, and with a final heave, he spilled out onto the ground. The lid clanged shut behind him as though slammed by unseen hands. The night was silent again, the moon shining cold and indifferent above. And Daniel lay gasping in the dirt, his heart convulsing in his chest. His hands shook so violently he could not grip the flashlight, and when he finally dared to glance at the well, the chain was drawn taut once more, the lock dangling in place as though it had never been disturbed. But he knew what he had seen. He knew what waited below. And worst of all, he knew that the face he had glimpsed among the shifting mass had looked not just like Ethan, but exactly like him too. His own eyes, his own mouth, opening in perfect mimicry. The well did not just call with voices. It remembered. After the night of his descent, Daniel avoided the well with the desperation of a man trying to ignore an open wound. He carried out chores with forced diligence, moved through the rooms of the farmhouse as though the sheer rhythm of routine might anchor him to sanity. But every shadow in the corner of his vision seemed to ripple with the memory of what he had seen below. He said nothing to Laura, not about the slime, the claw marks, or the faces swimming in that living mass. But silence proved no shield. For the house itself had begun to betray them. The voices no longer came only at night. In the mornings, while buttering bread or pouring coffee, Daniel would hear his wife's voice behind him, soft and clear. Though when he turned, she would be upstairs or outside. At first he tried to laugh it off, but then the same thing began happening to her. Twice, Laura stormed into the room demanding to know why he had been whispering her name, only to pale when he insisted he had not spoken at all. Soon after, both of them heard Ethan's voice drifting from the yard when the boy was sitting silently at the table before them, his eyes wide and unblinking as though he too could hear it. The phone began to ring again as well. Never during the day, never when they could check the line, but always in the quiet hours before dawn. The shrill sound tearing them from sleep. When Daniel answered, there was only silence, or worse, the sound of breathing, drawn slow and deliberate, like someone waiting for him to speak first. One night, he heard Laura's voice on the line, sobbing faintly, though she was asleep beside him. Another night, he heard his own voice, repeating words he did not remember ever saying. "It's safe down here. Just come down. Bring him with you." Ethan changed the fastest. The boy had once been restless and talkative, but now he drifted through the days with an absent gaze, as though his mind lingered somewhere else entirely. At times he startled them with bursts of clarity, speaking of things he could not possibly know. The sound of dripping water on stone, the color of walls deep underground, the sensation of hands brushing his in the dark. Laura wept when she heard him describe a tunnel full of faces that don't blink, swearing to Daniel that the child must have overheard one of his nightmares. But Daniel knew better. Ethan was not overhearing, he was listening directly. They began to quarrel, whispers turning to arguments, arguments rising to shouts. Laura blamed Daniel for bringing them here, for dismissing the warnings, for letting the boy wander so close to the well. Daniel, exhausted and terrified, lashed back that she had ignored the signs, that she had refused to leave when he first suggested it. Every word felt like kindling thrown on a fire already lit. And through it all, Ethan sat quietly, lips moving in soundless response to something neither of them could hear. One night, in the thick of another argument, Laura froze mid-sentence, her eyes darting toward the back door. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel wanted to deny it, but the sound was already clear. The latch rattling softly, as though someone were testing it from the other side. He stepped forward, heart pounding, and pressed his ear against the wood. A voice drifted through the thin glass. "Laura," it called, trembling and soft. "It's me. Let me in." The blood drained from her face. It was the voice of her mother, dead for nearly a decade. Daniel grabbed her hand before she could move, pulling her back. But the whisper came again, more insistent, layered with a wet echo. "Let me in. Please, don't leave me out here." Laura collapsed against him, shaking, and for a moment Daniel felt certain the door would burst open on its own. But when he dared to look again, the yard stood empty in the moonlight, the chain of the well rattling faintly, though no wind stirred. The following days blurred. Daniel slept little, his ears haunted by phantom ringing even in moments of silence. Laura grew pale and distant, her eyes shadowed as though she had aged years in mere hours. Ethan wandered at night, despite every precaution, doors bolted and windows latched. Yet Daniel often found him standing motionless in the hallway, head tilted as if listening to something whispering through the walls. Then one night, the whispers stopped altogether. The house lay steeped in silence, oppressive and thick, and for a fleeting moment Daniel almost dared to believe it was over. But when he woke to the chill of dawn light spilling across the bed, the stillness shattered. Ethan's blanket lay crumpled on the floor. His bed was empty. Panic seized Daniel as he stumbled through the house, calling the boy's name, each room echoing back at him with cruel emptiness. Laura followed, her face stricken, her voice raw with terror, until together they flung open the back door. The yard stretched silent before them, every blade of grass heavy with dew, and the elm tree loomed like a sentinel at the horizon. The lid of the well stood open. Daniel's legs nearly gave beneath him as he ran, the air tearing at his lungs, his heart beating so hard he could barely hear his own shouts. The circle of darkness yawned wide at the base of the tree, the chain dangling useless, the lock lying broken in the dirt. He leaned over the rim, flashlight trembling in his hands, beam plunging into blackness that revealed nothing but glistening stone. Then the voice rose from below. "Dad," it called, small and wavering, unmistakably Ethan's. "I'm down here. Please, help me." Laura screamed, clawing at Daniel's arm, but he was already tying the rope, already lowering himself into the maw that had been waiting all along. He could not think, could not breathe, could not imagine anything except his son's voice, spiraling upward from the dark. As his boots struck the first rung, the cold enveloped him once more, and the sound of dripping water echoed from the depths. But layered beneath Ethan's desperate cries was something else now. Low, resonant, inhuman. A sound like 1,000 voices breathing in unison, as if the well itself had begun to speak. And Daniel knew, with a clarity sharper than fear, that this time the darkness would not let them both come back. The rope burned against Daniel's palms as he descended, the circle of moonlight above shrinking until it was no larger than a coin, cold and unreachable. The air thickened with every rung, damp and suffocating, and the stone walls wept with moisture that slid in rivulets down to the black below. His flashlight quivered in his grip, the beam cutting narrow slices of light through the dark, revealing only glistening slime and claw marks gouged so deeply into the rock they seemed carved by something far larger, far stronger than human hands. Ethan's voice echoed upward again, high and thin, distorted by the walls yet heartbreakingly familiar. "Dad, I'm here! Hurry!" The sound spurred him down faster, though terror gnawed at his chest with each step. His rational mind screamed that the voice was not real, that it was nothing but a lure. But his heart betrayed him, dragging him deeper into the dark, with the desperate conviction that his son was waiting. The ringing started again, sharp, metallic, filling the shaft like a siren. It vibrated in his teeth, pressed into his skull until he thought his head might split. He gritted his teeth and pressed on, but as the sound reached a fever pitch, the voices came with it. Not only Ethan's, but dozens layered together, speaking in broken unison. "Daniel, Daniel, come to us. Bring him. Join us." He faltered on the ladder, the flashlight beam swinging wildly across the stones. For a fraction of a second it caught movement, something massive shifting just beyond sight, withdrawing into shadow. The rope shuddered as if brushed from below. Cold panic shot through him, but he forced himself downward, one rung at a time, until the beam caught the ground. It was not ground. At the bottom of the well stretched a surface that writhed and pulsed like the hide of some enormous beast. It glistened wetly, a sickly gray mottled with veins of black. And as the light swept across it, faces rose from beneath like bubbles breaking the surface of a swamp. Mouths opened in silent screams, eyes rolled white, features twisted in agony before dissolving back into the flesh. Among them, Daniel saw the face of a woman he did not know, then another and another, dozens, hundreds, all caught in the same endless cycle of surfacing and sinking. And then he saw Ethan. The boy's face pushed through the surface no more than 10 feet from him, eyes wide and glistening with tears, mouth opening in a desperate cry. "Dad, help me." The voice was perfectly his, raw and terrified. And Daniel nearly leapt from the ladder before another face rose beside it, his own. It stared at him with a mockery of desperation, lips moving in unison with his son's. "Help me." The two voices overlapped, blurred, until he could no longer tell them apart. Daniel's mind fractured. Every instinct screamed to save his son, yet a deeper dread coiled inside him, whispering that the boy was already lost, that the thing below was only dressing its hunger in the faces of those it had swallowed. His hands trembled, the flashlight beam jittering across the flesh, and in that stuttering light, he saw the truth. The mass was not still. It was climbing. Slowly, inexorably, it was pulling itself upward along the stone walls, tendrils of wet, muscular flesh gripping into cracks, dragging the weight of countless bodies with it. Where the slime smeared, the stone hissed faintly, as if eaten away by acid. The air thickened with the stench of rot and iron, and the ringing gave way to a chorus of voices, overlapping, weeping, laughing, pleading, all speaking at once, until words lost meaning. Daniel forced himself down the last rungs, boots sinking ankle deep into the heaving surface. The texture was nauseating, spongy, yielding like rotten wood, yet firm enough to hold his weight. Faces pressed up beneath his feet, their mouths opening as if screaming in pain from his step. He gagged, but stumbled forward, reaching for Ethan's face as it surfaced again, his son's eyes locked on him, filled with terror and hope. "Please, Dad, Please. He reached out. His fingers brushed warm skin. And in that instant, the truth revealed itself. The flesh beneath Ethan's face rippled, tearing open like a wound, and from it surged a shape. It was enormous. Rising taller than him in seconds, a column of coiled muscle and glistening hide. Limbs extruded from its body only to dissolve back again, fingers lengthening into claws before retreating, eyes blooming across its surface like boils. And at the crown of this shifting form, a mouth unfolded. Not one mouth, but many, layered within one another like concentric circles of teeth. From that abyssal throat, his son's voice poured forth again. Stay. Stay with me forever. Daniel screamed and swung the flashlight, smashing it into the creature's hide. The beam flickered, cracked, then went dark, leaving only the pale glow of the moon filtering faintly from above. The darkness was total, suffocating, alive. Something struck him across the chest, hurling him backward. He hit the wall hard, breath knocked from his lungs, scrambling blindly for the rope. But the stone was slick, coated with mucus, and his hand slid uselessly. The creature's tendrils coiled around his legs, cold and wet, pulling him toward the pulsing mass. He kicked, thrashed, screamed Ethan's name, but the voices only multiplied, rising in ecstatic chorus. They were no longer imitating. They were consuming him, speaking his thoughts before he formed them, echoing his screams back into his skull until he no longer knew which cries were his own. For one desperate instant, he felt the rope brush his hand. He seized it, gripping until his knuckles split, hauling himself upward with strength he did not know remained. The tendrils tightened, tearing at his flesh, but he pulled until the surface writhed and buckled beneath him. The faces shrieked, the voices wailed. And then, from directly above him, cutting through the chaos, came Ethan's voice again. Dad, don't leave me. Daniel froze. His grip faltered. The tendrils surged. In the darkness, he could not see, could not tell whether the plea came from his real son or the imitation. The rope burned in his hands as his strength ebbed, the weight of the thing dragging him down, deeper into the shifting flesh. And then, with a final heave, the rope lurched upward. Someone was pulling. The sudden jerk tore him free of the creature's grip, wrenching his shoulder, and he rose into the shaft, body scraped raw against stone. The chorus of voices followed, howling, promising, begging, until at last he was hauled out into the cold night air, collapsing onto the dirt. The lid slammed shut behind him with a metallic scream, the lock snapping back into place as though sealed by unseen hands. Daniel lay gasping, his chest heaving, his body shaking uncontrollably. He turned, expecting, praying, to see Laura, to see Ethan. But the yard was empty. Only silence. And then, from inside the house, through the open kitchen window, he heard it. Ethan's voice. Dad, I'm home.